We're just going to jump right in and everyone give a warm welcome to Gabe.
It's me again. It won't be me every time, though, so not even most of the time. Hold on, let me make sure I got this right. So, I was going to make a joke about how hard it is to prove that God exists, but kind of gives away the joke that it's on the board that I'm trying to prove that God exists. So, just to kind of, before we start, just want to give some intro remarks about kind of why we're doing what we're doing. By the way, can everybody hear me? Good. Yes. Great. Good. So, before I begin, I'd like to point out what the aim of having this talk on this subject is. Maybe a good way of doing that is by first saying what are not the reasons why Father asked me to give this talk. We're not going through this so that everyone in here can leave this hall immediately and find the nearest atheist to debunk. As we'll discuss later on, there are often other aspects at play when discussing the existence of God with someone who does not believe. Many of us today have preconceived notions of what it takes to prove something or how we come to know something that themselves have to be addressed to really get into the core of arguments for God's existence. When I enter into discussions with non-believers, as I often do, it's something that's near and dear to my heart as somebody who was once a non-believer. We spend more of our time talking about preconceived notions of, for example, what does it mean to know something? How is it that we come to know something? And so on. That's before we really get into the thick of things. So just saying this argument that we're about to go into to someone out of the blue doesn't really work that well. Arguments such as these, they most likely won't sway the everyday person who's having doubts, and it especially won't sway your average angry atheist who wants to badger Christians. We're also not having this discussion as kind of like a final chance for anybody who doubts God's existence. If you hear this argument and somehow you're not convinced, it's okay. I wasn't convinced when I heard these arguments either in the beginning, but through study and hard work, I think they're pretty good. What we are really aiming at in tonight's talk is to walk you through an argument made by one of the greatest intellectuals to have ever lived, and to show the method and the ideas behind that argument that make it work, all in the hopes of helping all of us here to realize that to be a Catholic or to be a Christian does not mean throwing away your intellect. St. Thomas and St. Augustine are some of the greatest thinkers of all time, respected far outside of the fields of theology. For example, in my degree, I'm in my philosophy portion right now, and I'm at a school that isn't a Catholic school, but we go over St. Thomas, we go over St. Augustine. They're that great. You have to deal with them at some point. And for them, studying God and contemplating who God is was a part of prayer. It was a part of your life. It was a part of your faith journey, is thinking about who God is and then going out into the world to people who may not know who God is and using philosophy, theology as a way of evangelization. So it's very important to consider that. So being a Catholic or a Christian does not mean having to deny the mind that God gave you to grow in love and knowledge of Him. It's a shame that in our times it has come to be common to think that being a Catholic or a Christian means to be irrational, but hopefully this talk can be a small beginning of doing away with that notion. So I have a scholarly instinct. I have to go through my sources to prove to you that what I'm saying is actually what they said. So a lot of this is pulled from Aristotle, his Physics and Metaphysics, and then St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae. What's interesting is that he wrote that book for beginners, but it's about 2,000 pages long. So the first clause is saying, hey, if you're interested in Catholicism, you might want to check this out. This is for beginners. And he proceeds to make one of the most difficult texts ever written, which is great. And then the last one is Ed Fazer's 5 Proofs for the Existence of God. Now, if you're interested in what I'm saying tonight, that's great. The first two texts, I would not recommend for a beginner. They're dense. I've been studying them ever since I got into philosophy. I'll always be studying them, and there's always something new to learn. But if you are interested, I highly recommend the third book. Highly recommend it. The practical example that I'm going to be using with the coffee cup, we'll be coming back to it over and over again. It's exactly what Ed Fazer uses in the book, and it's so easy to understand, and it's so simple, especially if you know someone who loves to read, who may have difficulties with God and with faith. It's such a great thing for them and as a resource to use. So those are the three sources. So this is our outline and overview. In the book of Romans, we're told that ever since the creation of the world, God's invisible attributes of eternal power and divinity have been able to be understood and perceived in what he has made. What this means is that we can know things about God from his creation in the same way that we can know things about a cause from its effect. For a practical example, by analyzing tire skids on a road, an investigator can determine how fast the car was going that made the skid marks. In a similar sense, what we know about the world helps us to know God more. My talk tonight will focus on practical, everyday things that we can perceive with our own senses. You will see that through putting the pieces together and what we observe, we can reach great heights, much like the way that science makes theories out of the data it gains from experience. It's the ultimate joke, really, that we're like opposed to science, because really what St. Thomas is doing in these proofs is not much different from what somebody like Einstein does when he makes the theory of relativity. He takes the data that the world gives him, and he makes a unifying account that makes that data make sense. So St. Thomas looks at the world, and he sees that change occurs, and he says, well, from that, God exists. It's pretty fun how he does that, and we'll see how he does that tonight. So basically, we're going to go through a bunch of things before we actually get to the argument itself. But that's because once we go through those subject matters, once we actually get to the argument, it's going to be easier to understand. If I just said the proof right now, it would be very confusing. It's very hard to understand if you don't have some little background knowledge. So one of the advantages of going through this is that we actually get a little philosophy 101 too, like especially Catholic-driven philosophy, Aristotle, St. Thomas, and stuff like that. So let's see, go to the first slide here. Hopefully you can read that. If not, I'm about to read it. So in the papal encyclical Fide Ratio, that's Faith and Reason. I just wanted to say something in Latin in the beginning. Pope St. John Paul II gives us the following quote, which is on the slide. Faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth, and God has placed in the human heart a desire to know the truth, in a word, to know himself, so that by knowing and loving God, men and women may also come to the fullness of truth about themselves. It's important to remember that God is truth itself, as this quote confirms. Christ says in John that he is the way, the truth, and the life. He also says that if you remain in his word, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. That's also in John. Our position as Catholics regarding the relationship between faith and reason is one that acknowledges that both are necessary to know the truth. But this position has in the past put us against an unlikely pairing of foes. On the one hand, there are those who deny the human capacity to reach the truth through reason, in the hopes of prioritizing faith alone to give knowledge. The name for this is like a fideist, someone who believes that only revealed truth is revealed truth. Our brains are useless, basically. So, on the other hand, there are those who consider faith to be backwards and to be the indulgence of people who are unintelligent. The irony in both is that in veering towards the extremes of one or the other, faith or reason, each has a tendency to undermine their own values. Those who believe that we must cling to faith specifically by denying the ability of the human mind doubt the ability of that same mind that God gave us to grow in knowledge of him. In addition, to quote Pope Benedict XVI, faith presupposes reason and perfects it. So to go into a little detail about that, reason, as we're about to see, tells us that God exists. But divine revelation, which is what we have faith in, tells us that this God that exists is the Trinity of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. We see in this life through a dark glass, St. Paul says. So we can see a bit of the truth. We can see that God exists, but it takes God's divine revelation to perfect what our mind can reach. So we think that there's an interplay of both. Also, God reveals to us in a way that we can understand. Scripture, for example, uses metaphors. They shall follow the Lord who roars like a lion. God speaks to us in metaphors and in ways that we can understand specifically. Because if we do not, in our minds, understand what it is that we have faith in, then what is it exactly that we have faith in? Who is this God that we believe in? That's a good thing to contemplate and a good thing to think about. To say, really, at the end of the day, we say a lot of things about God in our average everyday lives, but contemplating who God is a form of prayer itself. And it brings up important questions that we need to consider as Catholics and as Christians, I think. So, on the other hand, there are those who wish to elevate reason and the mind absolutely and abolish faith. Oddly enough, these individuals have the tendency to be dogmatic about their presupposed and unquestioned positions on many matters, such as what does it mean to know something, or by what method can we reach true knowledge? So a lot of scientists or whoever are people who are aggressive against faith. This isn't all scientists, by the way. This is just like the popular guys like Richard Dawkins who like to go and make fun of Christians. But they have these notions of what it means to know something, how we come to know something, how our world works, that science really can't answer. And they might have the right idea about those questions, but they're not doing science by coming to those answers. To ask what does it mean to know something is a philosophical question. And yet all of them have an answer on it, but you can't figure out basically what it means to know something by using the scientific method. There's no experiment that you can do to say, now we know what it means to know something. So a lot of the scientists, especially the ones who are like virulent and like to make fun of Christians and all that kind of stuff, they talk up their ability to use reason. They say, back in the ancient days, whenever the unintelligent people would see a lightning bolt, they would say, this must be Zeus angry at us. But the scientist looks at it and says, why? And there's some truth to that about finding out how things in the world work. But ultimately, their whole method itself is based off of presuppositions. They themselves have things that they accept without the scientific method, without using their own methods. It's important to know. So when you have somebody that's really against faith and against the use of reason in terms of something besides science, like we're about to do, like when I tell you this argument, anybody who is like really against faith but also really for science, this argument is cogent, it's valid, it's a good argument. A lot of times they'll say that doesn't make any sense because it's not a scientific proof. You don't see the scientific method and all that. So in short, they're supposed to be the people in their perspective who say, if you prove something to me, I will assent because I'm the kind of person who accepts truth when I see it. But really what it comes down to is you have to play on their terms or they won't believe you. And that makes them a lot like the people that they supposedly dislike, who are religious people, right? They say, religious people just assume things and they don't look deeper into it. But a lot of scientists do the same thing, right? So it's important to know. But science is a good thing, by the way. I'm not trying to say that science is a bad thing, but there are some scientists and there are some people who love science who don't quite understand what the limits of science are. And that's an important point to consider. So in our small group discussion leading up to tonight, we reviewed the first article of the Apostles' Creed. Question 2 of the review asks, how do we know that there is a God? The answer given states that we know that there is a God because reason proves it and faith confirms it. It may be odd for us as people living in today's age to hear of reason and faith agreeing on anything. In the following, I'll do my best to make good on the claim that reason proves God's existence by putting forth one of St. Thomas Aquinas' arguments for the existence of God, mainly the third way. So there's the coffee cup. That's my PowerPoint skills right there. So the first thing we're talking about is potentiality and actuality. So big words, right? But these two terms might seem abstract to begin with, but they're really very simple to understand. To start, I'll make an uncontroversial statement. Everything in the universe goes through change. A thing can change from being located in one place to another. It can change from hot to cold. It can change from resting to moving. Any change that occurs involves something that is potential becoming actualized. In simpler terms, potentiality is a natural power that anything possesses. For example, human beings have the natural power to think. A bird has the natural power to fly, and water has the natural power to freeze, evaporate, and so on. Now, when a bird is not flying, and when water is not frozen but in its liquid state, these potentialities or natural powers are just that, pure potentialities, meaning that they are not currently being actualized or realized. To make clearer what the idea of what a natural power is, a flower does not have the natural power to think. We as humans do not have the natural potential to fly. We have to use machines to do that. I don't like flying. And a rock does not have the natural potential to evaporate. A natural potential is a power that something has on its own accord just by being what it is. So because I'm a human, I can think, because that's what humans do. That's a power that we have. Actuality is when a natural potentiality or a natural power is realized. When that water in its liquid form becomes frozen, it's actualized. That frozen potentiality is actualized. So to restate, every change that occurs involves something that is potential becoming actualized. Now I'll introduce the practical example that we'll be continuing to return to throughout tonight's talk. A cup of coffee sitting on a table in a house. I'm a big fan of coffee, maybe some of you are too. So Ed Fazer's example sticks with me really well, and I think it's a great example to really start this off. So let's imagine that I get up early Saturday morning and travel to Starbucks in New Iberia to get some coffee. Now, right now, I have to travel to New Iberia to get some coffee because that's the place, but in a couple of months, my dad and the mayor of Erath are going to be opening up a coffee shop in Erath. So that's not what's, I was supposed to use that for the example, but me bringing this up is an advertisement, so I'm going to get free coffee forever, for bringing this up. That's my invoice. I'll send that to him later. So once I get the coffee, I come back home, set the coffee on the table, and forget about it. The coffee's hot at that point. The coffee as a liquid has the natural potential to be hot or cold. It does not have the potential to fly out of my cup unaided. Somebody would have to throw it at me if they were upset. So let's imagine further that after I forget this cup of coffee on the table, that I decide to turn on the air in my house. My coffee will inevitably get cold after being cooled by the air from my air conditioner. This is a good way of getting to the last point I'd like to make about potentiality and actuality. What is it that makes the coffee cold? It's the cold air from my air conditioner cooling the liquid coffee. Something that has the potential to be cold becomes actually cold by something else that's already cold. That's a really philosopher way to say something, but basically something that's already cold makes something that's not cold, right? So we'll come to see soon that this applies to existence too, our existence. Something that potentially can exist comes to exist by something that already exists, right? So next we're gonna quickly talk about something called linear causality. The picture's a really good way to think about it. So when we think about the process in time of my coffee becoming cold, it's easy to construct those events in terms of cause and effect. This process of in time cause and effect is called linear causality. The picture on the slide of the dominoes falling helps to communicate that. If we knock down that first domino, all the rest fall in succession, right? So in the same way, I decided I was too warm in my house. I flipped the switch on my air condition, which cooled the air, that in turn changed my coffee from hot to cold. When people read the arguments that we will get to in a second, they often assume that this is the type of causality being discussed, that God is the first cause that starts the Big Bang and brings us here today. That's what I thought St. Thomas meant myself when I first encountered this argument. Actually, that's not true. This argument is true whether the universe has a Big Bang, whether the universe is infinite, it doesn't matter, whether it has no beginning or no end. The argument still holds. So if we think about my example, we can show how thinking about linear causality doesn't work. So when we imagine that I feel like my house is too warm, I get up and flick the switch on my air conditioner, but let's add that right after flicking the switch, I unfortunately evaporate into thin air. The coffee will still be cooled no matter if I'm there or not. I've already flipped the switch. So if we hinge our argument on this kind of causality, God doesn't have to exist for the universe to exist. He could have just did something and then disappeared, and we'd still be gone today. So really short on that one. But what this argument really talks about is hierarchical causality. We're returning to the coffee cup here. I didn't just put the same image twice. There's a reason why I put that image there. So the causality that St. Thomas is using for this argument is not linear causality, but what we call hierarchical causality, another abstract word that we can make easy to understand by returning to my coffee. I said earlier that once I return from Starbucks or my dad's coffee place when he opens it, I put the coffee cup on my table. Rather than talking about something happening in time, though, let's pause time right there and consider how the cup of coffee is being held up. My cup of coffee is being held up by my table, but my table can't hold that cup of coffee on its own. My table is being held up by my floor and the foundation of my house, which is raised for reasons we all know. The foundation of my house and all that holds it up is itself finally held up by the ground. Without the ground, none of the things holding up one another and my coffee cup, not my table, my floor, my foundation, none of these things could hold up anything. They would all collapse or float away if they were in space. So compare that example to the linear example. In the linear example, even if I disappear after I flick that switch, my coffee still becomes cold. In this example, when you take away the ground, you lose it all. So keep the example of the ground in mind, because the ground is really the true cause of all the other items being able to hold up anything at all. It is this idea of God as the ground of existence of all things that St. Thomas is really talking about. So, boom, the Vitruvian man. I mentioned existence a few times already, so we should probably address it now. I exist, you exist, and everything around us in the universe exists in some way, shape, or form. However, it is not essential that I, you, or anything around us in the universe exists. The way this is commonly communicated is by saying that for things in the universe, like us and everything else, their existence is separate from their essence. So what is essence? Essence is equivalent to one of Aristotle's terms called form. In more direct language, an essence of something is what it means to be that thing. That's a little tough to grasp, but some examples may help. If we consider a triangle, it is a part of the essence of that triangle to be a three-sided figure whose angles add up to 180 degrees. A triangle can still be a triangle without its sides being equal. So a human being is essentially a rational animal. We're the animal that thinks. There are human beings with different color hair, eyes, and skin who are different sizes, but they're still human. Because what really makes us human is that we're the thinking animal, right? That's the essence of what it means to be human. It's what sets us apart from everything that we know that this is a human or that that's a triangle. That's what the essence of something. So how do I know that it's not a part of our essence to exist? I know this because I'm a human being, and there was a time when I did not exist, and unfortunately, there will be a time when I no longer exist. As we will see later, everything in the universe is like this. If it were a part of our essence to exist, we would have always and will always exist as we do now. Like if existence was a property I had, I could just keep myself existing. I wouldn't need to do anything. But obviously, we grow, we come to being, and then we pass away. So that means that existence is not a part of our essence. I know that's a little difficult, but it's okay. So once we discuss this final section, we will be ready to quickly and easily go through the argument of St. Thomas. It's a beautiful image, by the way. I love it. St. Thomas will use the language of possibility and necessity, by which he means the following. Something is possible or contingent if it's possible for it to exist or not to exist, and if it is subject to change in any way. So even matter is contingent, right? Even if the universe is infinite with no Big Bang, matter transforms and changes, which means it has potentiality in it. We'll get to that later. So anything possible or contingent does not account for its own existence. That does not just mean that it can't bring itself to existence. It also means that it cannot sustain its existence as well. Like I said, I needed my parents who already existed and God who exists to bring me into existence. But also, I need God ultimately to keep me existing. I can't just make myself exist. And God does that for the entire universe. He's like almost like the power cord for the entire universe that's consistently keeping everything afloat. So, like I said, if it was a part of our essence to exist, we would always exist. So, think of a contingent thing or a possible thing like my cup of coffee getting cold. In the same way that my hot cup of coffee has the potential to be cold, a possible or contingent thing has the potential to exist. What that means is that any possible thing or any contingent thing requires something else already existing to bring it into existence and sustain its existence, in the same way that my coffee cup needed something already cold to make it cold. Right. Something necessary, on the other hand, must exist. It cannot not exist, but has always and will always exist and sustain the existence of everything that comes to be. Think of the necessary like the ground that holds up my house, my table, and my cup of coffee. So finally, we'll get to the argument itself. By the way, I know you can't read that. I thought it was going to be a much bigger screen, but I'll read it. So we'll come to a close by formally addressing the argument finally. So here's the argument in full. If you don't understand this after I'm done, it's okay. The third way is taken from possibility and necessity and runs thus. We find in nature things that are possible to be and not to be, since they are found to be generated and to corrupt. And consequently, they are possible to be and not to be. But it is impossible for these always to exist, for that which is possible not to be at some time is not. Therefore, if everything is possible not to be, then at one time there could have been nothing in existence. Now, if this were true, even now there would be nothing in existence, because that which does not exist only begins to exist by something already existing. Another classic philosophy way of saying something. Therefore, if at one time nothing was in existence, it would have been impossible for anything to have begun to exist. And thus, even now, nothing would be in existence, which is absurd. Therefore, not all beings are merely possible. But there must exist something, the existence of which is necessary. But every necessary thing either has its necessity caused by another or not. It's impossible to go on to infinity in necessary things that have their necessity caused by another, as has already been proven in another argument that we didn't talk about. Therefore, we cannot but postulate or assume or show that the existence of something, of some being having of itself its own necessity, and not receiving it from another, but rather causing in others their necessity. This all men speak of as God. You know, it's funny, a lot of people consider God to be like a guy in the sky that looks a lot like Zeus that throws lightning bolts at people that he gets angry at. Not often that you hear God discussed of as this way, like the ground of all existence. But this is what we believe. And a lot of the problems between us and people who do not believe is that a lot of times people who do not believe do not have an accurate representation of what we mean when we say the word God. And a lot of times, I'm still growing in that too. We all need to grow in what we understand by that word to mean. So St. Thomas's argument is simple, but very effective. It is logically sound and cogent. The argument follows, which means that if every premise in that argument is true, the conclusion is true. The argument can be summed up very quickly in this way. All things in the universe are possible to be and not be. That means they come to exist and then they fall away. In other words, they're contingent. If everything there is was contingent, nothing would have ever come to exist. Therefore, there must be something that exists which is not contingent, but necessary, existing eternally and sustaining all that exists. Simply put, if everything that exists is the type of thing that needs something else for it to exist, nothing would ever exist. We would be stuck in an infinite loop. So to drive it home, let's consider one last time my cup of coffee on the table. In the same way that my table, my floor, and my foundation cannot by themselves hold up anything or each other, so contingent or possible things cannot exist on their own. If there was no ground making it possible for anything to hold up anything, nothing could be held up. If there was no ground making it possible for anything to hold anything, nothing could be held up. I just read that sentence twice, but that's because it's important, I guess. Everything would float away or collapse. If there were nothing that exists necessarily, making it possible for other things to exist and sustaining their existence at every moment, nothing would have ever existed. This is why the reply of who created God, you hear that a lot of times, God created everything, who created God, it misses the point. You would just be adding another table, another floor, another surface that you need that ground. You can't escape it, or else you're in an infinite loop, which is actually a logical fallacy. The ground and the need for a ground cannot be escaped. This necessary thing, because it is necessary, must be unchangeable, purely actual, with no potentiality, and in the end, it is this that we call God. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gabe. One more round of applause for Gabe, guest speaker. At this time, we're going to break off into our small groups for a little while before we close out the night. Before you leave tonight, I would just ask that you say a closing prayer in your small group. I think it's in your prayer journal. But so at this time, we'll just take a minute to go through our prayer journals together in our small groups.